In a world where conflict seems unrelenting, the United Nations Security Council stands as a symbol of hope. However, its 79-year journey has been marked by significant challenges. Its first session, held on January 17, 1946, aimed to prevent the horrors of war, yet the Council now faces ongoing crises, particularly in the Middle East, where the plight of Palestinians remains unresolved. As geopolitical tensions escalate and major powers pursue their own interests, the Council's effectiveness is increasingly questioned. This anniversary serves as a poignant reminder of both its achievements and failures, prompting a critical examination of its role and the reforms needed to achieve lasting peace. Welcome to In Depth. UN News has reported that around 90% of Gaza's population has been displaced due to ongoing Israeli military operations, with many being forced to move multiple times. The region is largely in ruins, with strikes damaging or destroying 60% of buildings, including homes, hospitals, and schools. The destruction crippled healthcare, caused environmental hazards, and severely impacted water and sanitation system. Despite these dire conditions, displaced residents remain determined to return and rebuild their homes. While a potential ceasefire may bring hope for reconstruction, and the psychological toll of the conflicts is profound, humanitarian aid, delayed by checkpoints, is crucial, with the World Food Programmes prepared to distribute supplies to over 1 million people once access is secured. The United Nations has announced its readiness to increase humanitarian aid to Gaza following a ceasefire agreement, urging the removal of political and security obstacles to allow essential supplies to reach all Palestinians in need. According to a Sharq al-Awsat newspaper, U.S. Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the ceasefire as a critical first step and emphasized the urgency of addressing the catastrophic humanitarian situation. With Gaza's healthcare and infrastructure severely damaged, including the destruction of hospitals, schools, and water systems, the UN aims to scale up food and medical aid. However, challenges such as security threats, restrictions on access, and the potential ban of the UNRWA in Gaza pose significant hurdles. The UN stresses that all aid routes must remain open to prevent further suffering. "79 years ago, the first session of the Security Council was born from the ashes of war, tasked with safeguarding global peace. Today, as this anniversary is marked, the world still reels from conflict, with Gaza's deepening crisis underscoring the Council's inability to resolve ongoing humanitarian disasters.
As the world observes the 79th anniversary of the Security Council's first session, global conflicts continue to dominate headlines, with the dire situation in Gaza demanding urgent attention. Established after World War II to promote peace and security, the Council now faces mounting criticism for its inability to address ongoing humanitarian crises effectively. In recent months, violence in Gaza has escalated, causing significant loss of life and widespread suffering. This starkly underscores the UNCS's failure to act decisively. Activists and leaders express frustration over the Council's inability to mediate a lasting resolution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which has endured for decades. The humanitarian toll is staggering. Thousands have been displaced and essential services are collapsing under the strain of conflict. Critics argue that the Council's member states often prioritize competing national interests over a unified approach to peace. The global power dynamics influencing the Council's decisions are intricate and fraught with challenges. Major powers such as the United States wield disproportionate influence, frequently prioritizing strategic alliances over humanitarian concerns. For instance, US support for Israel complicates efforts to achieve a balanced resolution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. As world leaders commemorate the Security Council's inaugural session, they face a sobering reality. While the UN has achieved notable successes in peacekeeping and human rights advocacy, it now confronts a crisis of credibility. Calls for Security Council reform are growing louder, emphasizing the need for more effective response mechanisms to prevent further tragedies. This anniversary serves a bold celebration of past achievements and a stark reminder of the work required to fulfill the UN's founding promise.
And for more analysis, we're joined by Mr. Mohammed Osman, an international relations specialist from Cairo. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Osmani. And let me start with, how have the interests of the major powers, such as the United States, influenced the decisions made by the Security Council so far, particularly with regards to conflicts such as those in Gaza, the West Bank and Lebanon, and other areas in the world that are not as powerful as such?
Thank you for having me, Mona. We have to clarify first that the United Nations Security Council is the only executive body of the United Nations. It's the only executive organ of the UN since its inception in 1945. And since it's the executive orders that wields the power, it is a political body before anything else. And of course, the power of the Security Council is exercised by the member states, primarily the 5 permanent member states: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. These countries exercise these powers inside the Security Council in accordance with their national interests and not in accordance with so-called international responsibility of any sort, or international legal or moral responsibility even. So when it comes to Gaza and Lebanon and the occupied Palestinian territories in Lebanon, and the common feature of all of this is the Israeli aggression against these countries, the United States never shied away from exercising its veto power inside the United Nations Security Council in order to protect Israel. Out of 87 vetoes the United States has exercised since 1946, 49 were voted in order to protect Israel, either from condemnation or from accountability. So that gives us an idea how the United States is furthering the impunity of Israel and its illegal occupation of Palestine and other Arab lands, whether in Syria or in Lebanon. Such impunity that is provided by the United States makes the effect of the U.S. veto powers on the conduct of the Security Council deleterious, destructive, harmful, if you understand me. So I think it renders it in such situations that it should exercise its powers in times of war, on conflict. On many occasions, it renders it useless and powerless. And even when the United Nations Security Council issued resolutions before that, one of them a few months ago that obligated Israel to, and the other parties called for a ceasefire, the United States went out and said that this resolution is not binding, and therefore the international community, or the collective West, was not willing to do anything to pressure Israel to adhere to a ceasefire. The Resolution 242 in 1967, it says it actually explicitly demanded that Israel withdraw from the Arab and Palestinian territories it illegally occupied in 1967. So far, this resolution was never implemented. So this gives us an idea of how affairs are run inside the Security Council, Mona.
Well, let me here welcome our second guest, Professor Majid Boudin, who is a professor of international law from Paris. Good afternoon to you, sir. And let me here ask you why the UN Security Council hasn't been able to resolve the ongoing crisis in Gaza, despite numerous emergency meetings.
Well, because the Security Council has two tasks. The first task is when the Security Council is taking resolutions, these resolutions will become then part of international law. And the resolutions are compulsory. On the second hand, Security Council is dealing with business matters, with political affairs, and then its members are taking their positions in respect of their respective interests. And the main thing that should happen is that the Security Council must take its resolution on the basis of international law. But when we see the Security Council members taking the resolution only to satisfy their state individual interests, then we go out from the duty to make application of international law. And therefore, we have failures. The Security Council is normally obliged to make application of international law in equal terms to everybody on the same ground, on the same level, and to have law be applicable to every party. We see, for instance, for the Israel case, that when the matter is regarding Israel, then members of the Security Council, they forget about international law, and this is why they are breaking international law itself. And this is why the recommendation that the world must do and to the Security Council is to recall to each member of the Security Council to make full application of international law. And the failure to make application of international law is a breach of international law. And members of the Security Council are also liable for breach of international law. And we should bring these matters before the International Court of Justice to make application of international law and to tell and to order the member states of the Security Council, and particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, that they have the duty to make application of international law. Without making application of international law, all international law will collapse. And the world is based on the application of international law, and the members of the Security Council are the guardians of the keepers of international law, and they must be the first to make application of international law to everybody, to every state, to every situation.
Right.
And there is a failure here.
Right. Let me get back to you, Mr. Osman. And from your point of view, how has the United States' unequivocal support for Israel reflect on the Security Council's ability to address humanitarian crises in Gaza?
Of course, again, it was detrimental. It was harmful because it basically rendered the UN Security Council unable to compel Israel or obligated to facilitate the access of humanitarian workers and humanitarian aid into the beleaguered Gaza Strip. It all depended on the will of the Israelis and how much aid they are willing to allow in, which aggravated the humanitarian crisis, making it one of the worst man-made humanitarian crises in the 21st century. So the United States, again, with its veto powers, with its with the lack of its will, because any action taken by the Security Council, even if it issues a certain resolution on a certain matter which has a binding nature legally, it cannot be applied, like Professor Bowden just said, without the explicit will of the member states of the Security Council, primarily the stronger states, the most powerful states, and chief among them, of course, is the United States. So if the United States always stood in the way of facilitating humanitarian aid to Gaza, for example, in order to secure Israel's impunity and its ability to flee or evade accountability.
But Professor Bouden, from your point of view, don't you think that this inaction regarding many of the Middle Eastern crises from the UN Security Council reflect on this world body credibility and legitimacy?
Of course, and we have to maintain the credibility and the legitimacy of the Security Council. It's a very important piece, part in the component of the security in the world. But if there is a failure within that mechanism, it doesn't mean that we have to throw out this mechanism. To the contrary, we have to consolidate this mechanism by calling on the permanent state members to make application of international law, because inaction is already a failure. To act and to commit an illegal act, it can be a positive act, which is an illegal act, international illegal act, but also to not act, to fail to act, to omit to act is also an illicit, an internationally illicit act. Therefore, what certain members of the Security Council are doing by omitting to protect the weaker party in a conflict is by itself a failure, and it's by itself they are liable for that. We have to go to the International Court of Justice to ask them to recall by an advisory opinion, and this any state can do it, to ask by an advisory opinion, like what South Africa has done in this in the Israeli attack on Gaza. We have to find a state who will go to the ICJ and to ask them to give an advisory opinion, which is compulsory, and to tell the member states that they have to apply international law in their resolution, and to draw the resolution based on international law. And if there is a dispute on that, to go back to International Court of Justice and to ask a decision from the International Court of Justice.
Mr. Osman, let me here ask you now, a huge number of members of the UN, and definitely a huge number of countries, have called for reforming the UN, and particularly the UN Security Council. Now, what kind of reforms does the UN Security Council need in order to be more effective in addressing humanitarian crises and ensuring accountability?
Well, Mona, as I said at the beginning of this interview, the UN Security Council is a political body. Actual power is exercised by the permanent 5 members who also have veto powers. The rest of the 10 temporary elected members who serve about 2-year terms, they are ineffective largely and cannot do anything in order to pivot the Security Council in a certain direction without the consent of all 5 powers. So now there have been demands for the past decades of the expansion of the UN Security Council. These were dismissed at first, but then the United Nations Secretariat and even several Secretary Generals have adopted these demands and said that the Security Council has to be reformed. Some countries offer conditional support. The United States very recently, in this Biden administration that will leave in a couple of days, said that it's willing to engage in the reform of the Security Council. And by reform, and even Russia supported that, the United Kingdom and France gave lip service to that. However, when it comes to action, none of these very powerful nations are willing to share their power with anyone else. And this is how states function in general, from at least from the realist perspective of international relations. So when we look at that, it doesn't surprise me that these calls for reform are ineffective. However, what these calls have called for, what they have envisioned, is the expansion of the permanent members of the Security Council to include countries that represent the global South, for example, and even Europe. The name of Germany was proposed, Japan, India, Brazil, Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, all of these countries, especially that Africa does not have any permanent member state of the UN Security Council. However, it all depends on the will of the Great Five, and the Great Five will never give up power, in my opinion.
So we're speaking here about the will. So if there is a will, there is a way, right?
Indeed.
And words should be enacted, or at least we should see words changing into deeds. Professor Boudin, what are the challenges the UN Security Council faces in addressing this very complex conflicts of or cause, the Israeli-Palestinian one?
I mean, the Palestinian one, from a legal point of view, is a straightforward matter, very simple. If we apply international law, it's a very simple case to be resolved. The problem is that in this matter, we don't apply international law. This is the key point. So we have to face those states whom they don't want to apply international law, and to bring them to apply international law. This case is very simple. There is a resolution. There is resolutions of the United States since 1947, 48, etc., 67, and we should make application of these conventions, of these treaties, of these resolutions, and then we apply the basic rules of international law, the international customary law, and the matter can be resolved. The problem is that there are interests that are taken on board which are against the law, and people are closing their eyes, meaning that they don't want to make application of international law on these matters. And this is why there is a feeling of strong impunity, non-accountability from the part of Israel. And this is the reason why this war is continuing. Mm. And now the public opinion have seen that, and this is a strong pressure on states, but it's not sufficient. And the second tool is the recourses to go to the judicial bodies of the United Nations, International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, but we have to. The only way is to request and to push, and we have means to push to make application of international law. Mm-hmm. There is no other way, specific way to do except that. But the path is there, the tools are there, the means are there, and we can continue to do it, and we have to do it.
Mr. Osman, from your point of view, what ways can the civil society and non-state actors contribute to a more effective multilateralism within the framework of the United Nations?
Well, Mona, do you want me to be honest with you?
Yes.
Okay, nothing. They can do nothing about it because this is a matter of international relations. This is the matter of power politics between the different power makers in the world.
Indeed, so, but we're speaking here about a world body that should be representing the whole world. No, the populations, the peoples of the states. So, yes. there are non-state actors, there is a civil society, there are populations who needs their voice to be heard. In which way?
Yes, their voices can only be heard through their governments. And believe me when I tell you that in even countries where it is permissible that they voice their aspirations and their anger, they would rather use the time to address their domestic issues, as we always see, rather than going on a quest to make the entire world a fairer place. I wish the world was a better place than what I'm telling you now. However, that is the reality of things. Yes, there are non-state actors, there are civil society organizations all over the world that are very active and very influential. However, none of them enjoy a seat on the table. None of them are even UN members. None of them are even a subject of international law, a subject of public international law, and even Professor Boudin can support this assessment, and according to international law, is a state or an intergovernmental organization that is composed of states, of governments, and recognized states too, not only just states. So that's how things are. So I believe it's very far. Maybe in several countries, there are actually NGOs in the United States, in Japan, and many other countries around the world that do advocate for a fairer international system. However, what did they do so far? They have been active since the times of the Cold War, since the 1960s. And so far, these results have yielded nothing. What will determine the reform of the Security Council is power politics. Now, there are other rising powers other than the 5 permanent members, the middle powers of the world, the members of the BRICS, other members of the G20, the G77 plus China. The global south now is calling for a voice,
Yes.
and maybe they will be granted a voice at some point. However, civil society.
We are in need for other voices. Unfortunately, my time is out here. But indeed, we need other voices to be heard. That was Mr. Mohammed Osman, International Relations Specialist, and Professor Majid Boudin, Professor of International Law. Thank you so much for your fruitful insights. And I guess that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Many thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.